Welcome to an exploration of the military books by Huntington, Finer, Clausewitz, and Janowitz, essential texts in the field of civil-military relations. These authors have significantly influenced our understanding of the military's role in society and politics. Samuel P. Huntington's The Soldier and the State establishes foundational concepts of military professionalism and the necessity of civilian control over the armed forces. Samuel Edward Finer's The Man on Horseback analyzes the military's impact on political stability and power dynamics. Karl von Clausewitz's On War provides critical insights into military strategy, emphasizing the interconnectedness of the army, government, and civilian population. Lastly, Morris Janowitz's The Professional Soldier delves into the social and political aspects of military life, revealing its complexities and implications. Before delving into these pivotal discussions, please click the subscribe button to support the creation of more informative content. Now, let's begin.
All right, let's kick off our deep dive, and we're looking at civil-military relations this time.
Yep.
And, we always try to pick like a good foundational text to kind of ground our conversation. And you went with Samuel Huntington's The Soldier and the State.
Yeah.
So you've got, I see excerpts from the book itself, your own notes, and it looks like you've pulled some interesting images too.
Yeah, it's The Soldier and the State. It's a classic.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because it was written way back in 1957.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
But it still has a lot to say about the relationship between military power and civilian authority.
Okay.
Which is really what we mean when we talk about civil-military relations.
So this isn't just some theoretical debate for academics to like argue about in their ivory towers, right?
No, not at all.
This relationship, it actually has real implications for all of us.
Oh, absolutely.
Even if we're not, serving in the military or working in government.
Absolutely. Civil-military relations, they impact everything. It's everything from national security to how decisions about war and peace are made.
Right.
It even influences a society's values and how power is distributed.
Okay, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So going through your notes, it seems like Huntington had some pretty strong opinions about how this relationship should work, like the ideal scenario.
Yeah, he did.
He makes this distinction between objective civilian control and subjective civilian control of the military.
Okay.
Can you unpack those terms for us a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So imagine like objective control as creating a clear separation between the military and politics.
Yes.
The focus there is on military professionalism. So developing expertise, maintaining a distinct military culture, and making sure that the military is focused on its primary function.
Okay, so
which is defense.
Everyone's kind of staying in their lane.
Exactly.
Okay.
You want a highly trained and effective military, but one that's firmly under civilian oversight.
Okay.
Subjective control, on the other hand, is more about maximizing civilian power over the military. And that can sometimes lead to politicization, which can have some negative consequences.
Interesting. You've also got this image here of the Roman army.
Yeah.
How does that connect to these different types of control?
Well, I think the Roman army is a fascinating case study.
Okay.
On one hand, it was incredibly powerful.
Right.
It played a key role in expanding and securing the empire.
Yeah.
But that very power also made it a potential threat to internal stability, especially when emperors were weak or there was political turmoil.
So it's kind of a double-edged sword.
Yeah.
You need a strong military to protect you from external threats.
Right.
But it also creates this internal risk.
Exactly.
So the emperors were always walking this tightrope.
Yeah.
Trying to keep the army strong, but also under control.
Right. And that tension between military power and civilian authority, it's something that all societies have to grapple with, even today. And in your notes, you highlighted some modern examples where countries are struggling to maintain that objective control.
Right. Yeah, and it's unsettling to see instances where there's political interference in military appointments.
Yeah.
Or when the military is being used for domestic political purposes.
Right.
It feels like a slippery slope.
It can be. It definitely can be. And those kinds of actions, they can undermine military professionalism.
Yeah.
Erode public trust in the military and ultimately weaken national security. But, of course, there are also plenty of examples of countries that are doing a good job of maintaining that balance, where civilian leaders respect military expertise, but also hold the military accountable to democratic values.
It sounds like a constant balancing act. It makes me think about another one of Huntington's ideas, the military as a profession,
Yeah,
almost like a society apart. And, to illustrate that you picked an image of a Spartan soldier,
I did.
which seems pretty fitting.
Yeah.
So Huntington argues that the military isn't just another job.
It's a unique profession with its own specialized knowledge, skills, values, and culture.
Exactly.
And the Spartans kind of embody that perfectly.
Yeah.
Their entire society was structured around military effectiveness.
Exactly.
Right? They were legendary for their intense training and warrior ethos.
Yeah, and I think you even have a quote here from The Soldier and the State,
Yeah.
where he compares the military to other professions like medicine and law.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
And he points out that all of these professions require extensive training, a strong sense of service, and adherence to a specific code of ethics.
Right.
But what makes the military even more distinct is that it deals with the ultimate responsibility,
Okay.
the use of force.
And the Spartans definitely understood that. They were warriors first and citizens second. But that level of dedication to military life,
Yeah.
it had its downsides too, didn't it?
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Like Spartan society wasn't exactly known for its individual freedoms or
Yes.
artistic expression.
Yeah, not so much. So it kind of raises the question of whether Huntington's idea of the military as a society apart
Yeah.
is still relevant today.
It's a good question.
I mean, you've got some notes here where you're wrestling with this.
I am. I think it's a really interesting question.
Yeah.
Because, think about it. Modern militaries are much more diverse than they used to be.
Okay.
Technology plays a huge role, and soldiers are way more integrated into civilian life than they were in the past.
Right.
But at the same time, the military's core mission, the willingness to use force that still requires a certain mindset and training that sets it apart.
Yeah.
So I think there's still aspects of military culture, the language, the customs, the way decisions are made
Right.
that are distinct from civilian society.
Okay.
So maybe it's less about being a society apart and more about recognizing that the military is a unique and vital profession within society.
A profession that, like you said earlier,
Yeah.
needs to be carefully managed to ensure that it serves its purpose without undermining democratic values.
Precisely.
And that kind of leads us to another key challenge,
Okay.
which is finding the right balance between civilian control and military professionalism.
Right.
To illustrate that, you've included this image of a modern soldier, and I think it perfectly captures the complexity we're talking about, because think about it. Technology has transformed warfare.
It has.
We've got drones, cyber warfare, artificial intelligence. How do you even maintain civilian control over something that's constantly evolving and requires such specialized knowledge?
It's a huge question, and it's one that's becoming increasingly urgent. So you need civilian leaders who understand these new domains of warfare, who can ask the right questions,
Okay.
and who can provide effective oversight. But you also need military leaders who are experts in their fields,
Sure.
who are comfortable with these new technologies, and who understand the importance of civilian control and democratic values.
It sounds like the lines are blurring a bit, which makes that balance even harder to find. And to make things even more complicated, you pointed out that all of this is happening in a world with evolving threats.
Right.
Terrorism, hybrid warfare, the spread of misinformation. These are challenges that Huntington couldn't have even foreseen when he was writing in the 1950s.
Absolutely. And, these new threats often don't fit neatly into traditional categories of warfare,
Right.
which can make it difficult to determine how and when to use military force. They raise ethical dilemmas that add another layer of complexity to the whole issue of civil-military relations.
This is a lot to unpack, but I'm really starting to see why understanding these dynamics is so important for anyone who wants to make sense of the world today.
I'm glad to hear that because, like we said at the beginning, this isn't just an academic debate. This has real implications for all of us.
Okay, so we've talked about objective versus subjective control, the military as a distinct profession, and the challenges of finding the right balance in a world of evolving threats. Where do we go from here? What are some of the key takeaways that we should keep in mind as we continue this deep dive?
Well, I think the first takeaway is that civil-military relations are dynamic
Okay.
and constantly evolving.
Makes sense.
What worked in the past might not work in the future.
Yeah.
And we need to be adaptable and willing to rethink our assumptions. Second, I think it's important to remember that there's no one-size-fits-all solution.
Okay.
The ideal balance between civilian control and military professionalism will vary depending on a country's history,
Right.
culture, and political system.
So what works for one country might not work for another.
Exactly.
Got it.
And finally, I think it's crucial to recognize that this is an ongoing conversation.
Okay.
We need to be constantly asking questions, challenging assumptions, and
Yeah.
debating the best way to manage this complex relationship.
That sounds like a call to action.
It is.
And speaking of action, I've been thinking about something you mentioned earlier, the potential dangers of the military becoming too powerful. In intervening in politics, you know what Huntington called Praetorianism?
Right.
It seems like a pretty serious risk, especially in a democracy.
It is a serious risk.
Yeah.
And it highlights why it's so important to have strong civilian institutions that can provide oversight and accountability for the military.
Yeah.
We need a system of checks and balances to ensure that no one branch of government, including the military, becomes too powerful.
And we need citizens who are informed and engaged in these debates.
Absolutely.
Because ultimately, it's up to us to hold our leaders accountable and to ensure that the military remains a tool for protecting our freedoms, not a threat to them.
Well said. I couldn't agree more.
And I think that's a perfect segue to the next part of our conversation,
Okay.
where we'll delve deeper into some of the historical examples of Praetorianism and explore how this concept is playing out in the 21st century.
It sounds good.
This is getting really interesting.
Yeah, it is.
I'm intrigued.
Yeah, me too.
Okay, so we're about to dive into some historical examples of Praetorianism, where the military gets a little too big for its britches
Yeah.
and starts meddling in politics. I'm ready for some juicy historical drama.
Well, you've come to the right place. History is full of cautionary tales
Yeah.
about what can happen when the balance between military power and civilian authority gets out of whack.
Give us the highlights. Where should we start?
Let's go back to ancient Rome,
Okay.
since we were just talking about their army. The Roman Republic, believe it or not,
Yeah.
actually had some pretty strong mechanisms in place to prevent Praetorianism.
Okay.
They had this system where military commands were divided and rotated frequently
Okay.
to prevent any one general from accumulating too much power.
Smart move. They clearly knew how to learn from their mistakes.
They did, but as the Republic expanded and faced more and more complex challenges,
Yeah.
things started to change.
Yeah.
Generals like Julius Caesar
Oh, yeah.
gained enormous popularity and influence through their military victories, which allowed them to challenge the authority of the Senate.
And Caesar, well, let's just say he wasn't exactly known for his humility
No, he was not.
or his respect for civilian authority.
Definitely not. His rise to power and the subsequent civil wars
Yeah.
marked a turning point. The Roman Republic gave way to the Roman Empire.
Right.
And with that shift, the military became increasingly intertwined with politics.
Okay.
The Praetorian Guard,
Yeah.
originally created to protect the emperor,
Right.
ultimately became a kingmaker,
Oh, wow.
wielding immense power,
Yeah.
and often deciding who would rule.
So from protectors to power brokers.
Exactly.
That's a pretty dramatic shift.
It is.
And it seems like this whole idea of Praetorianism wasn't just a Roman problem, right?
Right. We see similar patterns throughout history. Like in medieval Japan, the samurai class gradually gained more and more power,
Okay.
eventually establishing a military government known as the shogunate
Right.
that overshadowed the
Okay.
emperor.
You even have some notes here about more recent examples like Latin America in the 20th century.
Yes, many Latin American countries experienced periods of military rule during the Cold War,
Okay.
where generals seized power, often with the justification of restoring order or fighting communism.
Right.
And these military regimes, they frequently suppressed dissent,
Yeah.
violated human rights, and further destabilized the very societies they claimed to be saving.
Wow. Those are some sobering examples.
Yeah.
It seems like there's a recurring theme here.
Yeah.
Whenever you have a weak civilian government, a powerful military, and some kind of crisis or perceived threat,
Right.
the conditions are ripe for Praetorianism to take root.
That's a great observation.
Yeah.
And it highlights why it's so important for democracies to have robust civilian institutions, a clear legal framework for the use of military force,
Okay.
and a culture that values civilian control.
Makes sense, but all of these examples that we've been talking about are from the past.
Right.
How does Praetorianism manifest itself in the 21st century?
That's a great question, and it's one that scholars and policymakers are grappling with today.
Yeah.
While we don't see outright military coups in established democracies as often anymore,
Okay.
there are still subtle and sometimes not so subtle ways that the military can exert undue influence in politics.
Okay, I'm all ears. Give me some examples.
Well, one way is through the revolving door
Okay.
between the military and the defense industry.
Mm.
When high-ranking military officers retire,
Yeah.
and then they take up lucrative positions in defense companies,
Right.
it can create potential conflicts of interest
Okay.
and blur the lines between military priorities and corporate profits.
So there's this whole lobbying aspect to it. That makes sense.
Exactly. Another potential area of concern is the growing reliance on private military contractors.
Okay.
These are essentially private companies
Okay.
that provide military-related services.
Like those security firms you see protecting embassies or operating in conflict zones.
Exactly.
Okay.
And while there can be legitimate reasons for using contractors,
Yeah.
the increased privatization of military functions raises questions
Yeah.
about accountability and oversight.
Right.
Who's really in control
Yeah.
when private companies are carrying out tasks that were traditionally the domain of the military?
That's a really interesting point. It seems like the lines are getting blurrier in so many ways.
They are.
And you've got some notes here about how the rise of technology and the changing nature of warfare are also adding new dimensions to this whole debate about Praetorianism.
Absolutely. The growing importance of cyber warfare, for example, creates a whole new set of challenges for civilian control.
Okay.
Cyber operations, they often require speed and secrecy,
Right.
which can make it difficult for civilian leaders to provide effective oversight
Yeah.
or to fully understand the risks and consequences of these operations.
It's like a whole new battleground that most civilian leaders aren't equipped to navigate.
Exactly. And then there's the issue of artificial intelligence and autonomous weapons systems
Right.
as these technologies become more sophisticated.
Yeah.
We're going to have to grapple with some really difficult questions about who makes decisions about the use of force,
Okay.
how much autonomy we're willing to give to machines,
Right.
and how we ensure that these weapons are used ethically and responsibly.
It feels like we're entering a whole new era of warfare,
It does.
and the old rules might not apply anymore.
Yeah, how do we even begin to think about civilian control in a world where algorithms are making life or death decisions on the battlefield? It's a question that's going to require a lot of careful thought and debate.
Yeah.
We need to make sure that civilian leaders are educated about these new technologies,
Okay.
that they're involved in setting policies for their use,
Right.
and that there are clear lines of accountability for when things go wrong.
Because things will go wrong. Right.
Of course, no technology is perfect.
Yeah.
And that's why it's so important to have these conversations now.
Right.
Before these technologies become even more widespread and powerful, we need to be proactive, not reactive.
So we've talked about the historical roots of Praetorianism.
We have.
How it's manifesting itself in the 21st century.
Hmm.
But what can we do about it? How can we ensure that the military remains a tool for good, a force for protecting our freedoms,
Yeah.
not a threat to them?
Well, like we've been discussing, the first step is awareness.
Okay.
We need citizens who understand the importance of civilian control,
Right.
who are informed about the issues,
Yeah.
and who are willing to hold their leaders accountable.
Education is key, and not just for citizens,
Sure.
but for military leaders as well, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Military education should emphasize the importance of democratic values, the rule of law, and the principle of civilian control.
Okay.
Officers need to understand their role in a democratic society and the importance of staying out of partisan politics.
And it's not just about education.
Right.
We also need strong institutions, Brian.
You're exactly right.
Yeah.
We need a robust system of checks and balances that ensures no single individual or institution, including the military, can accumulate too much power.
Right.
This includes things like legislative oversight, judicial review,
Yeah.
and a free and independent press that can hold those in power accountable.
And a culture that values and respects civilian control.
Yes.
It can't just be something that's written down on paper. It has to be something that's ingrained in the fabric of society.
I agree. We need to foster a climate where it's considered unacceptable for the military to overstep its bounds
Yeah.
or to interfere in the political process.
It sounds like there's a lot of work to be done, but I'm feeling more hopeful after this conversation. At least we're starting to ask the right questions.
I agree. The more we understand the challenges,
Yeah.
the better equipped we'll be to address them. And I think that's a good note to end on as we move into the final part of our deep dive.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground in our deep dive into civil-military relations. We've explored Huntington's ideas, looked at historical examples of Praetorianism, and considered the challenges of maintaining the right balance in the 21st century.
Yeah, we have.
It's been pretty eye-opening, to be honest.
It's a fascinating topic.
And I think you've really driven that point home with all the examples we've discussed, from ancient Rome to modern-day concerns about cyber warfare and AI. It's clear that this is something we need to be paying attention to, not just leaving it to the experts.
It really is. I mean, this relationship between the military and civilian society, it impacts all of our lives.
Absolutely. And you've mentioned the importance of education a few times now. What would a more robust and effective approach to educating both civilians and military leaders about civil-military relations look like?
Well, for civilians, I think it starts with incorporating these concepts into our education system, and earlier than we do now.
Okay.
Not just in college-level political science courses, but even in high school. We need to help young people understand the basic principles of democratic governance, the role of the military in a free society, and the potential risks of unchecked military power.
So a more proactive approach, rather than waiting for a crisis to happen before we start having these conversations.
Exactly. And for military leaders, I think it's crucial that professional military education emphasizes not just technical skills and strategic thinking,
Right.
but also ethical decision-making, the importance of civilian oversight, and the dangers of politicization.
We've seen throughout history, and even in some current events, how things can go wrong when military leaders start to see themselves as above civilian authority,
Oh, absolutely.
or when they allow their personal political beliefs to influence their actions.
It's a slippery slope.
And I think it's also important to foster a culture within the military that values critical thinking, encourages open dialogue, and rewards those who speak up when they see something that's not right.
Couldn't agree more.
So it's not just about blind obedience.
No.
It's about having a strong moral compass and the courage to do the right thing, even when it's difficult.
I think that's well said.
And that goes for civilians, too. We need citizens who are willing to speak out against the misuse of military power, who are willing to challenge those in authority, and who are willing to defend the democratic principles that underpin a healthy civil-military relationship.
It really is about shared responsibility, isn't it?
Yeah. Both civilians and the military have a role to play in ensuring that this relationship remains balanced and productive.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Yeah.
It's about building trust, fostering mutual respect, and working together to safeguard the values and institutions that make a democracy strong and resilient.
Okay, so we've talked about the need for education, strong institutions, and a culture that values civilian control. Any final thoughts for our listeners as they continue to ponder these complex issues? What's the one thing you really want them to take away from this deep dive?
I think the most important takeaway is this. Civil-military relations are not something that we can afford to take for granted.
Okay.
They require constant attention, open dialogue, and a willingness to adapt to changing circumstances.
And to remember that this isn't just some theoretical debate.
Well,
The way we manage this relationship has real-world consequences for our security, our freedoms, and the kind of society we want to live in.
well said. So stay informed, stay engaged, and don't be afraid to ask the tough questions.
Great advice. And on that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive into the fascinating world of civil-military relations. Thanks for joining us. Welcome to another deep dive. This one might seem a bit, well, historical.
Oh,
We're going back to 1964.
okay.
Yeah, using a book by Morris Janowitz.
I know Janowitz.
Yeah, The Military and the Political Development of New Nations.
Ah, classic.
It is, but here's the thing.
Yeah.
It's scary how much it still applies today.
I'm intrigued. What's the angle we're taking?
Imagine you're advising a brand new country, like just got independence. What do they need to know about their military?
That's a great way to frame it. Because it's not just about, like, tanks and guns, right? It's about the whole relationship between the military and the
Government, the
people.
people.
Whole system, yeah.
Exactly. So to start, when Janowitz talks about these new nations, who's he actually talking about?
He's mostly focused on those countries in Africa and Asia
Okay.
that got their independence or modernized really fast
Yeah.
after World War II.
It's not like a formal category, though.
No, not like developed or
Yeah,
whatever.
yeah.
It's more about the shared experience they were all going through. Similar economic problems,
Yeah.
social stuff.
Right.
But the biggest one, I think, was figuring out the military.
Like where it fits in once you're not fighting for freedom anymore.
Exactly. How do you go from an army of, revolutionaries to an army that actually helps build a stable nation?
And that's not an easy transition. What I find interesting is who Janowitz doesn't include.
Oh.
Latin America.
Oh, yeah.
They had tons of coups, military involvement in politics.
Right, right. But their history's different.
Totally.
They got independent way earlier. So by the time Janowitz is writing their civil military, how they work together, it had already evolved along a different path.
He's zeroing in on that post-World War II wave.
Where things were still raw, like figuring it out as they went.
So let's get into those raw issues. Janowitz starts with this concept of
Legitimacy.
legitimacy, right? Seems simple,
Okay.
but huge GE for new nations. Why is it so important, especially when we're talking about the military?
Okay, so legitimacy is, at its core, whether people believe their leaders have the right to actually rule.
Like, do they deserve to be in charge?
Exactly. It's the bedrock of any government. But imagine a country where everyone thinks, man, these guys are phonies.
Damn.
Guaranteed. And for new nations, it's even more fragile. They've just gone through revolutions, independence struggles, huge upheaval.
The old ways, gone.
Gone.
But the new one's still got to prove itself.
And the military gets tangled up in this legitimacy question in a really interesting way.
Because they're the ones with the guns, right?
In a way, yeah. On one hand, the military being organized using force, they can be a powerful symbol, right? Like authority.
So a new government might use them to show strength, especially if things are shaky.
Exactly. Project that control.
Yeah.
But here's the paradox Janowitz is getting at.
Okay.
This book is about how the military can help these new nations modernize with, and this is key, as little force as possible.
That seems kind of backwards. You'd think strong army equals they just impose order? Done.
Right. But Janowitz is saying no.
So why? Why emphasize this less forceful approach?
Because real lasting stability, it comes from people being persuaded, not just forced. If you want a nation to develop, grow, people got to buy into the system, not be scared into it.
So you're saying the military can be part of that,
Hmm.
but under the right conditions.
Exactly. And those conditions, that's all about what kind of civil-military relationship you've got going on.
Okay, so we need to define that. What does a quote-unquote healthy relationship look like?
Janowitz starts by, well, he looks at how the industrialized nations did it,
Okay,
just to give us a comparison point.
makes sense.
He finds three basic models that were common in the West. So first, you've got the democratic model, probably most familiar to us.
Like the U.S., Europe?
Yeah, military's there for defense, foreign policy, they stay out of domestic stuff. Clear separation, civilian leaders, military leaders.
Elected officials make the calls, military carries it out. Classic.
But that's not the only way to do things.
So I figured. What else is there?
There's the aristocratic model.
Aristocratic.
Yeah, think old school Europe, knights, nobles, all that.
Okay.
Military and aristocracy were like totally intertwined. Shared ideology, shared interest. Control wasn't about rules so much. It was about like social bonds.
Interesting. So less about laws, more about who you know who you're related to.
Exactly. And then there's the third model, which, well, the 20th century showed us how real this one can get. The totalitarian model.
Totalitarian.
Here, the military is like a tool of the one-party state. They might get tons of resources, influence, but they're also tightly controlled. Secret police, party members in the ranks, constant surveillance.
So the party uses them,
uses them.
but also is scared of them.
Big time. They know a powerful military could turn on them, so they keep it on a very short leash.
Yeah.
But here's the catch. With all three of these models,
Yeah.
none of them quite fit what was happening in these new nations.
Because their situation was so different.
Totally. Their militaries were often way more prominent, playing a bigger role in everything, even daily life.
So Janowitz had to come up with something new.
He did. He went beyond those existing models and created a framework specifically for these newly independent or rapidly modernizing countries. He gets into 5 distinct types, which is what we're going to get into next.
I am ready. From least to most military power.
You got it. And remember, thinking back to that advisor role, each type comes with its own like opportunities and dangers.
All right, hit me with type 1.
Authoritarian personal control. Pretty much what it sounds like. The military's job is to keep one leader in power.
Like a strongman kind of thing.
Exactly. Often a charismatic dude rose to power during the independence fight, revolution, something like that.
Got any example?
Early Ethiopia, Haile Selassie. Or South Vietnam, Nunga Dinh Diem.
Okay, so you've got this powerful figure.
Yeah.
And the army's there to make sure nobody messes with him.
Basically, this type often pops up when a country's facing threats, instability. The leader leans on the military for security, then uses that power to make his own position stronger.
So if I'm advising a new nation and I see this happening, what should I be worried about?
The big question is, does this reliance on the military actually hurt the country in the long run?
How so?
Can you build a real democracy, a strong economy, all that good stuff, when one person is calling all the shots, backed up by guns? That's the dilemma.
That's a good point to ponder. All right, we got authoritarian personal control. What's next?
Type 2, authoritarian mass party control. Kind of similar, but instead of one big leader, it's the party that's in charge.
Ah, okay. Less about one person's charisma, more about the ideology, the organization.
Exactly. Think communist states or those single-party regimes that were common in Africa back then.
So the military's role is different here.
Yeah, they're often smaller, not as well equipped, and you see a counterbalance, like a strong police force, paramilitaries, all loyal to the party.
Sounds like they want to keep the army in check.
Oh yeah, they see them as a potential threat, limit their resources, keep them on a tight leash. Now for type 3,
Bit me.
this is the one everyone hopes for. Democratic, competitive.
Where the military stays out of politics.
Even during elections.
Yeah.
They respect the civilian government, focus on defense.
That's the ideal.
It is, but rare.
Especially back then.
Janowitz highlights India in the 60s, though.
Really?
Yeah, despite all their problems, they made it work. Democracy, military, mostly stayed in its lane. Shows it can be done.
Encouraging. All right, what about type 4?
This one's trickier. Civil military coalition.
Coalition.
The military is a major player, but alongside other groups. Political parties, unions, you name it.
So they're at the table,
Big time.
but not running the whole show yet.
That's the question. Is it stable? Can they stay a partner, or do they inevitably take over? Type 5 brings us to that takeover scenario.
I'm guessing that's full-on military rule.
Yep. Military oligarchy. Straightforward. The military IS. The government. Might have some civilian window dressing.
But the top brass calls the shots.
100%. Janowitz' main example for this one is Egypt in the early 60s under Nasser.
Ah, right. His free officers movement.
Took over a decade earlier. Military was firmly in charge.
So if we're advising a new nation and we see this pattern,
Yeah.
what are the red flags?
Well, even within military oligarchy, there's variation. Some are super obvious about it. Others try to look more civilian. The key is to look past the labels, understand how they got there, how they rule.
Nuance, 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 always.
So we've got these 5 types, from propping up one leader to full-on military rule. But as advisors, does this just mean we slap a label on a country and call it a day?
Nope. Janowitz gives us this cool tool, but then he takes it further. He actually puts 51 new nations, as of 1963, into these categories, like a snapshot of the world.
So we can see the trends. What's common, what's surprising, what our new nation needs to watch out for.
Exactly. You might think with all the talk about democracy that democratic competitive type would be everywhere.
Yeah.
Not even close. The most common were the authoritarian ones, which is scary. Shows how fragile things are early on. Good point. But there's more to it than just labeling, right? Can't just say, oh, it's authoritarian personal control and move on.
You got it. Janowitz says these categories are just the start. We got to consider the specifics, the history, the politics, even the culture of each place. He lays out 3 big factors that are super insightful.
Lay 'em on me. What's the first one?
Seems obvious, but people forget it. Historical background. Lumping all new nations together is silly. Their pasts are totally different.
Right. So how does he break it down?
3 main areas, each with a different relationship to, like, military power.
Okay. Area number 1?
South and Southeast Asia. This is where colonialism hit the hardest, totally reshaped everything. But here's the thing.
Yeah.
Even with centuries of kingdoms and empires, military rule wasn't like super ingrained in their culture.
Which is weird because they had a lot of coups and stuff later on.
Right. Makes you think maybe strong rulers in the past doesn't automatically mean the military will always dominate. Colonialism kind of messed with that. It created a void that new armies had to fill.
So their history isn't destiny. What about Area 2?
Middle East and North Africa. Totally different story. Long tradition of the military being in politics. Ottomans, caliphates, all that. Military leaders were often tied to religion, too, had a big say in how things were run.
So that legacy kind of carried over, even after independence.
Big time. And colonialism, while impactful, didn't reshape them as much as Southeast Asia. Those old ways of thinking about power, they stuck around.
So if you're advising a nation there,
Yeah.
you got to be aware of that history of the military being involved. Okay, what's Area 3?
Sub-Saharan Africa. Unique case because by the time they got independent, they had almost no indigenous military tradition left. Centuries of slave trade, then brutal colonialism wiped it all out.
So starting from scratch, but not in a good way.
Right. They had to build armies from nothing, often copying foreign models, which came with its own problems.
Dependence on other countries, stuff like that.
Exactly. So 3 very different historical contexts. South and Southeast Asia, colonialism disrupted things. Middle East, military involvement was already there. Sub-Saharan Africa, they had to invent it all.
No easy answers there, but I bet there's more.
Oh yeah, this is just layer 1. Janowitz's second big factor is about the origin of the military itself. How that army came to be matters a lot.
So even within a region, it's different.
5 types he lays out, and this is where it gets super nuanced, crucial for our advisor role. First up, non-colonial armies
Non-colonial.
grew organically without being forced on them by a colonial power. Think Thailand, never colonized, or Ethiopia fought off the Italians.
So they have that connection to the past.
Strong sense of tradition, national pride.
But can they adapt to the modern world?
That's the challenge, right? They might resist change, struggle to modernize.
Okay, what's origin type 2?
Ex-colonial armies. These are the ones inherited directly from, well, the colonizers.
Yeah.
British model, French model, it all makes a difference.
So trained by the British act differently than trained by the French.
Oh, huge difference. British were all about professionalism, separate military from civilian stuff. French, more hands-on, military keeps order, projects power.
Wow. So the colonial past still shapes things even after they're gone.
Like a ghost, lingering.
All right, origin type 3.
National liberation armies, born out of the fight for freedom. Guerrilla groups, resistance movements, they become the army.
I can see how those guys would get political.
Oh yeah, they see themselves as protectors, guardians of the revolution. Super suspicious of the old elites, anyone who seems like a sellout.
Makes sense. They fought for this. They're not going to let it slip away. Okay, what's type 4?
Post-liberation armies. Created after independence is already won. Different challenge. They get professionalized fast, build up their strength, prove they're legit.
From scratch, basically.
Ghana's a good example. Form their army after they were already free from Britain.
Tough job, right? Limited resources, maybe needing help from other countries.
Which creates its own dependencies. It's tricky.
Need an army, but don't want to be reliant on someone else.
Exactly. And finally, type 5.
Hit me.
Reflects how messy the post-colonial world is. Post-colonial with significant ex-colonial elements.
A bit of a mouthful.
Basically, a mix. New core, but lots of holdovers from the colonial days. Officers who served the old regime, equipment, even ways of thinking.
Tension City.
Oh, yeah. Old guard versus new blood. Janowitz uses South Vietnam as an example.
Yeah.
Post-liberation army.
Yeah.
But tons of officers had served in the French army before. Talk about divided loyalties.
Okay, to sum up our origins. Non-colonial, ex-colonial, national liberation, post-liberation, and this hybrid one, each with its own, baggage.
And each influencing how they act on the political stage. As advisors, gotta know the origin story.
Yeah.
It's not just where a country is, it's where they've come from.
Adds a whole layer of complexity. Okay, so we got history, we got origins. What's the third big thing Janowitz says to consider?
This one might seem off at first, but it's huge. Economic development. Now, here's the usual thought. Richer country equals more likely to be democratic. Military stays out of things.
Makes sense. Strong economy, less need for the army to get involved.
But Janowitz throws a curveball. The link between economics and the military's role is way more complicated.
Really? So booming economy doesn't equal hands-off army?
Not always. He does say that in super poor countries, you often see what he calls personalist rule. One leader relies on the military to survive.
Like we talked about, authoritarian personal control. When there's not much to go around, power gets concentrated.
And the military often becomes the decider.
But it gets weird after that, right?
But once you get past that extreme poverty, the link between economics and military intervention, it gets murky.
So a country doing better economically could still have a coup just as easily as a peaceful democracy.
That's what Janowitz found. Development doesn't guarantee anything. In some cases, it might even make military intervention more likely.
Now that doesn't make sense. You'd think prosperity equals less need for a takeover.
Seems that way, but here's why it might happen. As an economy grows, the military often wants more. better equipment, more pay, more say in how things are run.
So their appetite grows along with the economy.
You got it. And if the civilian leaders are seen as corrupt or failing to deliver, that creates tension.
The military thinks, we deserve more, we can do better.
Right. Plus, economic growth often brings social change. Urbanization, new elites, all of which can destabilize things. Military might step in to restore order, and some people might even cheer them on.
It's not just money, it's what comes with the money.
The social and political changes. And that's why Janowitz says you can't give economic advice without considering the politics. Boosting a country's GDP doesn't mean the military will just sit back and watch. It's all intertwined.
Okay, so to recap our big three factors: historical background, origin of the military, and this complex economic development thing. No simple answers there.
Nope. They're more like tools to help us understand how complicated this all is. Avoid making dumb assumptions.
But there's more to it than just the context, right? We got to look inside the military itself, what's going on in their heads.
Exactly. Janowitz doesn't just look at the big picture. He goes deep into the military as an organization, and it gets really interesting.
Okay, I'm ready for another deep dive. What does he focus on?
Everything. Their structure, their skills, where they recruit from, education, even their ideology. He wants to know what makes them tick.
Let's start with structure then. What do these armies look like in practice?
Well, keep in mind, it's 1964. No fancy drones or cyber warfare yet. Most of them are built on the World War II infantry model. Boots on the ground, basic combat skills, clear chain of command.
Old school, but effective.
And their experience level varies a lot. Some, like in Burma, had seen tons of combat. Others, barely any.
I can see how that would make a difference. Battle-hardened versus parade ground soldiers.
And here's another thing. They really wanted to be seen as different from the police. Soldiers, not cops.
Why is that? Just pride, or something deeper?
Janowitz says it's partly pride, but it has consequences. By not doing the messy stuff, repressing civilians, they keep this image of themselves as a clean force.
But that also makes them more likely to intervene in a big way when they DO-act, right?
You got it. They haven't been tarnished by the dirty work, so they can step in, looking like the good guys, acting for the nation. Makes them harder to resist.
That's a smart point. It's like they're saving up their legitimacy for a rainy day. Okay, what about their skills, though? Does military training actually prepare you to run a country?
Good question. Janowitz says it's a mixed bag. Some skills transfer, like logistics, planning, handling crises. But there are also big limits.
Like what?
Well, military training is all about hierarchy, following orders, making quick decisions, great for a battlefield, not so much for a politician who needs to build consensus, compromise, all that messy stuff.
So, are military leaders doomed to fail in government, then?
Not necessarily. Janowitz actually points to a certain kind of officer who's more likely to have the right stuff. He calls them adaptive career officers.
Adaptive career. What makes them different?
They've had experiences that force them to think outside the box, adapt to new situations, foreign postings, where they had to deal with different cultures. Maybe they worked with new technologies, learned to adapt quickly.
More flexible, more politically aware.
Exactly. They've seen more, had to deal with more, so they understand the world better. And Janowitz says these are the guys who might actually do well in a civilian role.
Like cabinet ministers, diplomat, even leading the country. So it's not impossible, but it takes a specific kind of military background.
Okay, what about where they come from? Their social class. Does that matter?
Big time. And it's different from, like, old Europe. Most of these new nations, there's no feudal aristocracy, no hereditary knights calling the shots.
So where do these officers come from? Mostly middle-class backgrounds, often rural roots, sons of teachers, small landowners, that kind of thing. A new generation, often the first to get higher education.
So they're ambitious, driven to succeed. How does that shape their worldview?
Well, on one hand, it makes them modernizers. They want progress. They want their countries to be successful. They're not stuck in the past. But on the other hand, it also makes them distrustful of elites, intellectuals, politicians who they see as out of touch.
Ah, so that explains some of the tension between the military and civilian leaders. They come from different worlds, different values.
Exactly. And that distrust can be a big driver for intervention. They don't just want power. They want to fix things.
Okay, so social background matters. What about their education?
Another key point. And again, different from Europe. Most of these officers, they don't come from purely military schools. They have a civilian education as their base. University degrees, engineering, law, even literature.
So wider range of ideas, exposed to different ways of thinking.
Right. Makes them more well-rounded. but also means they've been thinking about politics from a young age.
They're not just learning how to fight. They're learning about how the world works.
And that shapes how they see the military's role. Now, when it comes to their actual ideology,
Yeah, like their core beliefs about the military and society.
Janowitz says there's no one military ideology, but there are some common threads.
Like what?
Strong nationalism, for one. They're defenders of the nation. That's their core identity. Also a big emphasis on hard work, discipline, efficiency, a sense of duty, almost like a puritanical work ethic, but not in a religious sense.
I can see how that clashes with how some governments work, especially if they're corrupt or inefficient.
Big time. And that leads to another key part of their ideology. Distrust of politicians. We've talked about it, but it's really important. They see politicians as corrupt, self-serving, more interested in lining their pockets than serving the country.
We've talked about why they might think that, but is it just cynicism or something more?
Janowitz says it often comes from a genuine desire to see their country succeed. They're patriotic. They want things to work. They get frustrated when leaders fail to live up to their ideals.
So they think they can do better?
Sometimes, yeah. And that's where it gets dangerous. That belief, mixed with their distrust of politicians and their sense of duty, it can make intervention very tempting.
A recipe for a coup right there. Belief in their own competence, skepticism of the civilians, and that sense of mission. But how does it actually happen? What are the mechanics of a military takeover? So we've got all these factors pushing a military towards taking over their history, what's going on inside the military, even the economy. But how does a coup actually go down? Do they just show up one morning and announce it?
You'd be surprised. But Janowitz, he breaks it down into two main types. Calls them designed and reactive, and they're pretty different.
Design militarism sounds like a planned thing, right? Officers plotting in secret, like a spy movie.
Exactly. Think of it like a well-organized coup. They have a plan, a core group of leaders, and lots of support within the military. Like Nasser's free officers in Egypt. They spent years building up to it before they finally made their move in '52, got rid of the king.
So it takes brains, not just brawn. What about reactive militarism? Is that more spur of the moment?
It is, and it's way more common in these new countries. It's not so much a plan, more like reacting to a crisis.
Yeah.
The military sees the country falling apart, chaos, maybe the economy's tanking, violence in the streets. They think, we're the only ones who can fix this, and boom, they take over.
So they frame it as duty saving the nation.
Exactly. A patriotic act, even if they might actually believe it. Pakistan's a good example. They had a bunch of coups that were more reactive than planned, usually triggered by some mess like political deadlock, corruption scandals, or the economy going haywire.
Makes you think if the civilian government had done a better job, maybe the military wouldn't have felt they had to step in.
That's a big point Janowitz makes. It's not just about the military being willing to take over. It's about what makes it easy for them to do it. And here's a weird one. He found that coups almost never happen against one-party states.
Wait, really? That's surprising. Those regimes seem like they'd be prime targets.
It does, right. But think about it. Those one-party states, whether they're communist or whatever, they're really good at controlling the military. They put their own people in the ranks. They have their own security forces to keep the army in check. They use propaganda, surveillance, the whole 9 yards. They know a coup is possible, so they work hard to prevent it.
So they're so afraid of it, they actually stop it from happening.
Kind of ironic, right? It shows you how much power is about perception. And it's something for you as our advisor to think about. If you're helping build a new nation, you got to be smart about the balance of power. Not just between the military and the civilians, but between everyone. Different parts of the government, different political parties, all the groups that make up society.
Keep everyone in check so no one gets too powerful.
Exactly. Okay, so we've talked about things inside a country that can cause coups. But what about outside influences? Does Janowitz get into foreign policy?
I was just thinking that, like, these new nations aren't just dealing with their own problems, they're stepping onto a world stage that's already pretty messed up.
Right. And Janowitz hits on this. Remember, it's the Cold War. U.S. and Soviet Union are fighting for influence everywhere, offering aid, military support, all that. And that puts a ton of pressure on these new nations and their militaries.
So it's not just about who's in charge at home, it's about navigating global politics and trying not to get crushed in the process.
Exactly. Think about military aid. If a country depends on one superpower for weapons and training, that creates leverage. The military might feel like they have to keep that patron happy, even if it means going against their own government.
So a foreign power could actually encourage a coup, use the local military to get what they want.
Happened all the time during the Cold War. Latin America, Africa, Southeast Asia, you name it. One side backs a coup to get a friendly regime in power. The other side tries to destabilize things. Super dangerous game.
And for these new countries, it's like trying to learn to walk while balancing on a tightrope.
It's rough. Janowitz suggests that one way to avoid this mess is to get support from multiple countries. That way, you're not beholden to just one. It gives you more options, more independence.
Don't put all your eggs in one basket. Smart.
And it's still relevant today, even though the Cold War is over. You've got China, India, the EU, all competing for influence. It's a multipolar world now.
More complicated in a way.
For sure. But the idea is the same. Don't rely on just one power. Build relationships, diversify your support, and keep your options open. Okay, so we've covered a lot. Different types of coups, things that make them likely, foreign policy, the whole global context. But the big question is, can it be prevented? Can these new nations be stable and successful without the military constantly messing with politics?
That's what everyone wants to know. Can we avoid this whole cycle of coup and instability?
That's the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
And Janowitz, he doesn't give us a simple answer. But he does talk about some conditions that make what he calls political balance more likely. It's where the military does its job defending the country, but doesn't try to run everything.
Okay, I'm all ears. What does a healthy relationship between the military and the government look like?
The first thing, and it's the most important, is civilian control of the military. But it's not just about having a civilian leader in charge. It's about making sure the military itself respects civilian authority. They understand their place in a democracy. They follow the decisions of elected officials, even when they disagree.
So clear rules, professional standards, checks and balances, all that good stuff.
Right. And that's hard to do, especially when the military was so important in winning independence, or when they think they're the only ones who can protect the country. They might think they're above politics, that they know best.
Like, who watches the watchmen? You got to make sure even the guys with guns are accountable to the people. What else makes this political balance more likely?
Janowitz calls the second thing internal professionalism. It's all about creating a culture of merit, competence, and doing things the right way inside the military. Clear standards for everything, from recruitment and training to promotions and discipline. And those standards have to be applied fairly, no matter who you know or what your political views are.
So a professional military that's focused on defending the country, not on personal gain or political power.
Exactly. And it means emphasizing education, both military and civilian, encouraging critical thinking, teaching ethical behavior. You want officers who are not just good at fighting, but who are also thoughtful, responsible leaders who understand the world.
It's like you're describing a new breed of military leader, someone who can operate in both the military and civilian worlds.
Right. Someone who can work with civilian leaders, who respects the law, and who knows that their loyalty is to the Constitution and the people, not to some political party or ideology.
That's a great goal. But is it realistic? It seems super hard to achieve, especially for these new countries that are dealing with so many other problems.
It is tough. But Janowitz gives some examples of countries that did manage to find that balance, where the military played a positive role without taking over. India, like we talked about before, is a good example. They had huge challenges, but they made democracy work, and the military mostly stayed in its lane.
That gives me some hope, but it sounds like it takes a lot of things going right. Good leadership, commitment to democracy, and a bit of luck, maybe.
You got it. There's no one-size-fits-all solution. Every country is different. But Janowitz gives us a way to think about these problems, to analyze what's going on, and to try to find solutions that will work.
It's like a roadmap, not a set of instructions.
Exactly. It helps us understand how the military and the government should interact, and it shows us the dangers of letting things get out of balance.
Okay, so imagine I'm that advisor again, sitting with the leaders of this new nation. They want to build a successful country, a democracy that works. What do I tell them?
What's the most important advice you'd give them, based on all we've learned from Janowitz?
Well, first, I'd tell them to really understand their own history. Don't just try to copy what other countries have done. What worked for India might not work somewhere else. Every country has to find its own path.
Know thyself, right?
Exactly. And then I'd tell them to build a military that's strong and professional, but keep it under control. Invest in training, education, all that, but don't give them a free pass. Make sure the civilians are in charge. Set clear limits on what the military can and can't do.
Find that balance between a capable military and a strong democracy.
Exactly. And lastly, I'd remind them that building a successful country takes time. There are going to be problems, setbacks, maybe even crises. But if they stick to their principles, take care of their people, and build institutions that work, they have a real shot at making it.
Well said. It's a message of hope, but also a challenge. It reminds us that the future isn't set in stone. We have to create it day by day through our choices and our actions.
Well, on that note, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive into the military in new nations. Thanks for coming along on this journey with us. We've covered a lot of ground, from types of military rule to the factors that shape how things work out, from how coups happen to what a balanced system might look like.
It's been a great discussion, and I hope it's got people thinking about how important it is to get this relationship between the military and society right.
If you're interested in learning more, definitely check out Janowitz's book. It's a tough read, but it's full of smart insights that are still relevant today. And remember, figuring out how to have a military that serves the people, not the other way around, is something we have to keep working on all the time, everywhere.
It's a constant effort, and there's always more to learn.
Well, that's all for this episode of The Deep Dive. Thanks for listening.
Thanks for having me.
Welcome back, everyone. We're diving into some fascinating stuff today. Karl von Clausewitz, his book on war, using those excerpts he sent.
Ah, Clausewitz.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's not just some, dusty old military theorist.
Right, even though he was writing back in the early 1800s.
Exactly. His work is, well, it's surprisingly relevant, I think, even today.
Okay, so what are we focusing on? What's the big thing with Clausewitz in this deep dive?
Well, a lot of folks might think On War is just about battles, troop movements, that kind of thing.
Right.
But he actually goes way deeper, into the psychology of conflict, how politics play a role, even the role of chance, uncertainty, all that.
That's really interesting. I mean, when you think about it, those things are just as important today, right? I mean, especially uncertainty. It feels like that's everywhere.
Oh, absolutely. The world Clausewitz was writing about, it was changing rapidly, a lot like our own world, actually.
Okay, so let's jump into the book. One of the things that really stood out to me was this idea that war is basically like a giant duel.
Oh, yeah, he uses that analogy, doesn't he? The two wrestlers.
Yeah, he compares it to two wrestlers, each trying to overpower the other. So it's like not just armies fighting, but it's really about a struggle of wills.
Yeah. It's a powerful image, right? I mean, what he's getting at is this idea that war is ultimately about forcing your enemy to do what you want, to submit to your goals, your will, basically.
Yeah.
And that's a huge idea. Really changes how we think about conflict, even today, I think.
Yeah, it's like behind all the military stuff, there's this really primal human element driving the conflict.
Absolutely. But here's the thing, Clausewitz doesn't stop there. He says that while force is definitely essential, it's not just brute force.
So it's not enough to just have the biggest army or the most powerful weapons.
Right. You also need intelligence, and you need strategy. To use that force effectively, think of it like a swordsman, a really skilled swordsman. They don't just swing wildly. There's precision, timing, an understanding of the opponent to win.
Right. You have to know your enemy's weaknesses and use your strengths against them, not just charge in blindly. Kind of like, a game of chess almost.
Yeah, exactly. And this is where Clausewitz's work gets really interesting for us, I think. Even though the weapons have changed so much since his time, those basic principles of strategy, they're still super relevant.
Okay, so we've got this idea of war as a duel, right? A duel of wills where strategy and intelligence are key. But Clausewitz, he doesn't stop there. He goes on to talk about, he famously says, war is an act of policy. So he's connecting war to politics.
Oh, absolutely. He's saying war isn't some isolated thing. It's all tied up with political goals, calculations.
Okay, so you can't really understand a conflict without understanding, the political reasons behind it.
The motivations,
yeah.
Right. Exactly. And this connection between war and politics, goes both ways, right? Political aims, they shape military actions. But then the war itself, how it goes, that could totally change the political landscape. It's back and forth. always.
And Clausewitz saw this firsthand. I mean, he lived through the Napoleonic Wars, so he witnessed how politics and war, how they kind of feed off each other.
Exactly. And he noticed a big shift happening in his time, too, something we still grapple with, the role of regular people in war.
Okay, what do you mean by that?
Well, in the 18th century, wars were more like affairs between governments.
Okay, yeah.
But then in the 19th century, with the French Revolution and all that, we see more popular participation, the people becoming a bigger factor.
And Clausewitz really picks up on this, right? He even talks about Napoleon's campaigns.
Oh, yeah. Especially the invasion of Russia in 1812. That was a disaster for Napoleon. And popular resistance, the Russian people, they played a huge role in his defeat.
It's almost like he's anticipating this idea of, like, a people's war, which became so important later on.
Right. He's seeing how even a powerful army can be stopped by a determined population. That will to resist. It matters.
Okay, so far we're seeing how Clausewitz thinks about war way beyond just, military strategy.
Yeah.
He's connecting it to politics, to the people involved, to all these bigger forces that shape how a conflict plays out.
Exactly. And this leads us to another key idea, the culminating point of victory.
Okay, culminating point. Now that sounds interesting. What does he mean by that?
He's saying that even when you're winning, on the offensive, there's this point where your strength can actually start to decline.
So you're winning battles, but you're not necessarily getting stronger.
Right. It's like you reach a peak.
Yeah.
And then things can start to shift back the other way. The defender might gain an advantage.
Wow. So even if you're, like, on a roll, victory isn't guaranteed. It's not just a straight line to the finish.
Nope, not at all. It's more dynamic than that. Think about it. As an attacker pushes forward, their supply lines get stretched thin.
Right.
And they have to, hold the territory they've taken. Plus, the troops are getting tired.
So they're winning, but it's costing them. They're getting weaker in the process.
Exactly. And at the same time, the defender, they might be able to, like, regroup, get support from the local people, start to see the attacker's weaknesses where they're vulnerable.
Ah, so the momentum can shift, even if the attacker seemed unstoppable at first.
Yeah. And Clausewitz, he uses some great examples to illustrate this from the Napoleonic Wars.
Oh, right. Like Napoleon in Russia, that whole campaign in 1812.
Exactly. I mean, Napoleon's March on Moscow, a classic example of this culminating point.
Didn't he, like, lose most of his army because of, what was it, the weather? The Russians burning everything as they retreated?
Yeah, the vast distances, the harsh Russian winter, the scorched earth tactics, it just drained Napoleon's forces. Yeah. Completely.
It's a good reminder, I guess, that even the most powerful armies, they're not invincible.
Right. The defender can use time, space, strategic waiting, all of that to wear down an attacker.
Yeah.
And ultimately win.
So it's not just about brute force, right? It's about adaptability, too, being able to adjust to the situation to change your plans when you need to.
Absolutely. And this leads us to, another fascinating part of Clausewitz's work, his ideas about military genius.
Oh, okay. Military genius. So he's talking about, like, the great generals, the Napoleons of history.
Well, yes and no. When Clausewitz talks about genius, he's not just talking about, battlefield brilliance or tactical skill. It's more than that. It's this combination of intellect, courage, determination, and a deep understanding of all those factors we've been talking about, the psychology, the politics, the whole picture of war.
So it's not just about, like, winning battles. It's about understanding the bigger context, the forces at play.
Exactly. A true military genius. For Clausewitz, they have to be bold, but also calculate risks carefully. They inspire their troops, but also make tough, even cold strategic decisions. It's a balance.
It's almost like they have to have this sixth sense, this ability to see through the fog of war.
Right. Intuition, knowledge, experience, it all comes together. And speaking of fog of war, that brings us to one of Clausewitz's most famous ideas, the idea of friction.
Friction. Okay. Now I'm really curious. What exactly did he mean by that?
Well, he used this term to describe all those things that can mess up your plans, even the best plans, the things you can't really predict or control.
Okay, I'm starting to get it. So, like, even with, all the technology we have today, all the satellites and intelligence gathering, you're saying there's still this element of unpredictability in war.
Oh, absolutely. There's the fog of war, sure, but there's also, just human error. People make mistakes, especially under pressure. Miscommunication happens, logistics break down, troops get tired. And that's friction.
So how do you deal with that if you're a commander? I mean, do you just accept it as inevitable?
Well, Clausewitz says you can't eliminate friction entirely. No way. But you can try to lessen its impact by understanding where it comes from, planning for it as best you can.
So like building flexibility into your plans, having like a plan B, maybe
Yeah.
even a plan C.
You got to be able to adapt, improvise when things inevitably go wrong. And this is where, again, that military genius, that sense of warfare comes in, knowing when to stick to the plan, when to throw it out and try something new.
Okay, so friction, adaptability, this military genius. How do these ideas, how do they all fit together in Clausewitz's bigger picture of what war is?
Well, remember, he sees war as this dynamic thing, back and forth between attack and defense, between what you want to achieve politically and what's actually happening on the battlefield, between the rational and, well, sometimes the irrational things humans do.
Right, right. It's not just about like moving little soldiers around on a map, you know?
Exactly. It's messy, it's complicated, it's human. And Clausewitz, he's pushing us to think about war not as this thing with fixed rules, but as a process of constant change and adaptation.
That's what makes him so relevant today, I think. The world is changing so fast, just like in Clausewitz's time. The nature of war is changing too. Technology, everything.
Exactly. Think about cyber warfare, information warfare, terrorism. Clausewitz could never have imagined those things. But his ideas, they still help us make sense of them. Because at the core, it's still about strategy. It's about adapting. And it's about understanding human behavior.
Wow. So even in this age of, drones and AI, this 19th century Prussian general, his ideas can still help us.
Oh, yeah, big time. And that's why he's still studied. Okay, now getting a bit more specific, Clausewitz also dives deep into the ideas of tactics and strategy. You might be wondering, how are they different? How do they work together?
Yeah, those terms, people use them all the time. But I feel like with Clausewitz, he probably had a very specific way of defining them.
Oh, he definitely did. For him, tactics, they're about winning individual battles, engagements, But strategy, that's about using those battles to reach your overall goal, the political goal, the reason you're fighting in the first place.
Okay, so tactics are like winning a single game. And strategy is about like winning the whole championship.
Perfect. Exactly. And both tactics and strategy, they're constantly evolving. The best commanders, they can adapt them to the situation, the terrain, the enemy strengths, even the political mood.
It's not about just following the same playbook every time.
Right.
You have to be flexible, learn as you go, adjust.
Oh, right. And Clausewitz, he really pushes back against this idea that war is like some kind of science with fixed formulas.
So he's saying theory is important, but it can only take you so far. You have to be able to like think on your feet.
Exactly. There's always friction. There's always human error. Unexpected things happen. You have to be ready for that. That's why he says studying military history is so important.
Ah, okay. So you learn by looking at past campaigns, seeing how other commanders handled those same challenges.
Yeah. It's not about memorizing dates and battles. It's about, well, extracting the core lessons. What worked, what didn't, the patterns of how humans behave in war.
Right. The timeless principles.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And he was, really critical of theorists who tried to make war sound simple, to reduce it to just formulas.
He thought they were missing the human element, how messy it really is.
Exactly. Every conflict is different, unique. For him, military genius is all about being able to see those nuances, adapt, learn from your mistakes.
And that comes back to friction again, right? You can study all you want, but in the end, you have to be able to deal with those unexpected things, the things you can't plan for.
Absolutely. And that's a big part of why Clausewitz is still so relevant, even in our modern world. The technologies change, the tactics change, but the core challenges, they're the same. Leadership, strategy, understanding human nature, those things are always part of conflict.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground. We've talked about how Clausewitz sees war as this duel of wills, how it's tied to politics, to the people involved, how important strategy is, adaptability, learning from history. What else is important for our listeners to know? What other key insights did Clausewitz have?
Well, one thing that's often overlooked is his ideas about defense. It's not what you might think.
Okay, so most people, when they think about defense, they think about just, holding your ground,
Right.
resisting an attack.
Right. But Clausewitz, he says defense is more than that. It's active. It's about using your resources in a smart way, choosing your battles, waiting for the right moment to strike back.
So it's not just about being passive. You're saying there's like a strategy to defense too.
Absolutely. Clausewitz argues that a good defense, it can be more effective than a poorly planned attack. He compares it to a spring. You compress it, it builds up energy, then boom.
So the defender is kind of like storing up energy,
Yep.
waiting for the attacker to overextend themselves.
Exactly. And then bam, counterattack. He points out there are, lots of ways to have a good defense. Terrain, fortifications,
Yeah.
deception.
Like those classic examples, the Swiss defending in the mountains, or the Vietnamese using guerrilla tactics.
Perfect examples.
Yeah.
And what Clausewitz is saying is, even if your army is smaller or they don't have the best equipment, you can still win if you have the will, the determination, if you use your brain and exploit the attacker's weaknesses.
Okay, so defense, it's not just about absorbing blows. It's about knowing when and where to hit back.
Right. And that ties back to the culminating point we were talking about. The attacker, eventually, they reach their limit. A good defender, they can sense that moment and turn the tables.
That reminds me of, well, the American Revolution. The Continental Army, they were outmatched in a lot of ways, but they kept fighting, wore the British down, and eventually won their independence.
Yeah, great example. Both sides, attacker and defender, they have to understand this back and forth, constantly assess, adapt their strategies. It's dynamic.
Okay, so much to think about. We've talked tactics, strategy, defense, how it all connects back to Clausewitz's big ideas about war. What else? What haven't we touched on yet?
Well, we can't forget the political side of things. Clausewitz, he was adamant that war and politics they're inseparable. He said, and this is one of his most famous lines, war is a continuation of political intercourse with the addition of other means.
So he's saying war it's just another tool that countries use to get what they want, politically.
Exactly. He really criticized those theorists who tried to, separate war from politics. It's this pure military thing. He said, if you ignore the political side, you're going to have a bad time.
Okay. So to understand any war, you have to understand what each side is trying to achieve politically, what their goals are.
Absolutely. And he even said that war should always be subordinate to those political goals. Like the military, they shouldn't be calling the shots. They should be following the political leadership's lead.
Makes sense. Otherwise, the war just becomes about, winning for the sake of winning and not about achieving some larger goal.
Exactly. He was really big on civilian control of the military. The politicians set the goals. The military carries them out. That was his view.
Clear chain of command. Okay, so building on this idea of war and politics, Clausewitz, he talks about limited war and absolute war. What's the difference there?
Right. Absolute war, that's like this theoretical idea of a conflict where both sides are just all in, total commitment to destroying each other. No limits.
Sounds terrifying.
Yeah, no holds barred. But Clausewitz knew that most wars, they're not like that. They're limited in some way.
So there are boundaries, even in war.
Yeah, it could be political reasons.
Yeah.
Or maybe the countries just don't have the resources for a total war. Or there's the fear of things escalating out of control.
Right. During the Cold War, there was always that fear of nuclear war. So even though the U.S. and the Soviet Union were rivals, they never directly fought.
Exactly. And Clausewitz, he's saying, look, to understand war, you got to understand those limits, those boundaries.
Yeah.
Because they shape how the war is fought, how intense it gets.
That makes sense. Okay, so we've got limited war versus absolute war, this idea that politics is always shaping things. Anything else about Clausewitz's ideas on war and politics?
Well, he has some really interesting thoughts about how wars end.
Yeah.
It's not just about, winning on the battlefield. It's about what comes after the peace.
Right, because a bad peace can just lead to another war, right?
Exactly. Clausewitz, he says a lot of factors determine how a war ends, what each side wanted to achieve politically, how strong their armies were, how tired they are of fighting, all of that.
Like World War I, the Treaty of Versailles, it punished Germany really harshly. And, well, a lot of people think that helped lead to World War II.
Yeah, a lot of historians say that. And Clausewitz, he would say, I told you so. He didn't like the idea of punishing the loser too much. He thought it just made things unstable, led to more resentment, more conflict down the road.
So a lasting peace, a good peace, it's not just about, crushing your enemy.
Right. It's about finding a balance, recognizing that everyone has interests.
Right.
And being willing to, to move on, even if it's hard.
It's about building a peace that will actually last. Okay, so we've talked about the end of war, the importance of a just peace. Anything else from Clausewitz before we wrap things up?
Well, remember how we talked about war as a duel of wills, a clash of human determination.
Yeah.
We should talk more about the psychological side of warfare. Clausewitz had a lot to say about that.
Yeah, he wasn't just interested in, tanks and strategies. He was really interested in the human element, the things that make people fight or not fight.
Right. He said those psychological factors, they can be just as important as, having the best weapons, sometimes even more important.
So it's not just about who has the bigger army.
Nope. It's about things like morale, courage, discipline, being able to handle hardship, being able to face fear, all that.
Like the Spartans at Thermopylae. They were totally outnumbered, but they fought like crazy. Their morale was incredible.
Yeah. Classic example. Clausewitz said an army with high morale, even if they're outmatched, they can still win. But an army with low morale, they can fall apart, even if they have all the best weapons.
So understanding how your troops are feeling and how the enemy's troops are feeling, that's really important.
Oh, crucial. And Clausewitz talked about all the things that can affect morale. The leader's personality, whether the soldiers believe in what they're fighting for, even just the experience of winning or losing.
He even said that the fear of losing can make an army fight harder.
Yeah. It's fascinating. It all comes back to that idea that war is, at its heart, a clash of wills, a test of human determination.
Okay, so Clausewitz, he knew that psychology was a big part of war, but did he have any advice on how to actually manage those psychological factors, like how to boost your troops' morale or break the enemy's will?
He did. And this is where, you guessed it, friction comes back in. Remember, friction. It's all those unpredictable things, those intangible things that can mess up your plans.
Right. The fog of war, miscommunication, all that.
Yeah. And Clausewitz said those things, they can really affect morale. Big time. If a commander doesn't plan for friction, their soldiers can get demoralized.
Yeah.
Plans fall apart. The whole campaign can go south.
So even if you have a brilliant strategy on paper, if you don't manage the human element, the psychological stuff, it can all fall apart.
Exactly. And this is where, that Clausewitzian genius comes in.
Yeah.
A really great commander, they understand how friction works. They anticipate it, adapt to it. They know how to keep morale up, even when things are really tough.
Like George Washington. He managed to keep the Continental Army going through some really, really hard times. He must have been a master of managing morale.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Washington, he understood that side of things, the human side.
Yeah.
That was a big part of his success, just as important as his military skills.
Okay, so we've talked about friction, how it affects morale, how a good commander can deal with it. What other things about friction should we mention? What else is important for our listeners to know?
Well, one thing to remember is that Clausewitz saw friction as just a part of war. It's always there. You can't get rid of it completely, but you can try to minimize it by planning carefully, communicating well, building flexibility into your operations, basically creating a culture where people can adapt.
So it's about accepting that things will go wrong, but being prepared to handle it.
Exactly. And that's where training, discipline, and experience come in. A well-trained army, led by commanders who have, been there before, they're going to be much better at handling the inevitable challenges.
It's like that saying, the more you sweat in peace, the less you bleed in war. You got to be ready for the chaos, the friction.
Exactly. And that means more than just physical training. It's about building mental resilience, adaptability.
So you're saying a good army, they're not just robots following orders. They need to be able to think for themselves, solve problems.
Absolutely. You want soldiers who can make decisions on the fly, be creative, figure things out even when the plan goes out the window.
Okay, that makes sense. So friction, it can affect morale. What other ways can it impact a war?
Well, it can really mess with a commander's decision-making.
Yeah.
I mean, Clausewitz, he said friction makes it almost impossible to execute a plan perfectly because there's always missing information, unexpected delays, communication problems, the fog of war.
So even if you have a brilliant plan, actually putting it into action, that's the hard part.
Yep. And this is where Clausewitz's ideas about making decisions under pressure, they become really important. He said a good commander, they have to be able to decide quickly, even when they don't have all the facts.
So you got to be okay with not knowing everything. Trust your gut. Be willing to take risks.
Exactly. And that's where experience, good judgment, that sense of warfare, they all come into play. A good commander, they can often, sense the right move, even when things are unclear. And they're not afraid to act, even if it means changing the plan.
It's like that quote from Eisenhower, plans are worthless, but planning is everything.
Oh, yeah, good one. It's the process of thinking things through, beforehand that really prepares you for those moments when you have to make a decision fast.
Okay, so friction, it can mess with morale, it can mess with decision making. What other big effects can it have?
Think about how friction can affect, like, the whole course of a war, the back and forth between attack and defense. Sometimes it creates, well, surprising opportunities, or leads to big changes in who's winning.
So it's not just about individual battles. Friction can actually change who wins the whole war.
Absolutely. It can slow an attack down, disrupt supplies, make troops tired, hurt their morale, and it gives the defender a chance to, recover, get stronger, find the attacker's weak spots.
So even the strongest attack can kind of get bogged down by friction, lose its momentum.
Exactly. And again, this brings us back to the culminating point of victory. Even a successful attacker, they will eventually hit a wall. And a smart defender can use that to their advantage.
It's like the Vietnam War. The U.S. had all the firepower, but they got stuck in this long, drawn-out conflict. They couldn't adapt to the terrain. They couldn't win over the local population. Friction just ground them down.
Perfect example. Friction, it can be the deciding factor, even when one side seems to have all the advantages.
Okay, so understanding friction, being ready for it, that's essential for any commander who wants to win.
Oh, yeah. And that's why, again, studying military history is so important. Looking at how friction played out in the past, what worked, what didn't.
Learning from the mistakes of the generals who came before.
Exactly. But it's also about, recognizing those timeless principles of war, the things that are always true, no matter what the technology is.
Okay, so we've talked about friction, but Clausewitz, he also talks about different types of military objectives, right? Different things you're trying to achieve in a war.
He does. And he says, look, if you don't understand those objectives and how they connect to the political reasons for the war, you're going to have a bad strategy.
So it's not just about winning battles. It's about, having a purpose behind those battles.
Exactly. And Clausewitz, he starts with the most basic objective, destroying the enemy's army.
Okay, that seems pretty straightforward. Wipe out their army, you win.
Well, sometimes. Sometimes that's all it takes.
Yeah.
But Clausewitz says sometimes that's not necessary or even a good idea.
Wait, what? So there are other ways to win, other things you can aim for.
Yeah. And this is where he introduces this idea of the center of gravity. It's like the enemy's most important source of strength, the thing that holds their whole war effort together.
Okay, so instead of destroying their whole army, you find that one key element and you target that.
Exactly. And that center of gravity, it can be different things. They're a capital city, their main army, key allies, economic resources, even the will of their people to keep fighting. It depends.
It's like in chess. You're not just trying to capture any old piece, you're going after the king.
Exactly. Great analogy. And just like in chess, that center of gravity, it can move. It can change during the war.
You have to be constantly reassessing, looking for new opportunities.
Right, being adaptable. And that's a big part of how Clausewitz thought about strategy.
Okay, so we've talked about different objectives in war, the idea of the center of gravity, the importance of thinking strategically. Anything else before we wrap up our deep dive into Clausewitz?
Well, we should talk about how wars end. It's not just about winning on the battlefield. It's about what comes after. The peace.
Yeah, because a bad peace can just lead to another war, right?
Exactly. Clausewitz says the way a war ends, it depends on a lot of things. What each side was fighting for, how strong their armies are, how tired everyone is of fighting, all that.
Like World War I. The Treaty of Versailles was really harsh on Germany.
Yeah.
And a lot of people say that's part of why World War II happened.
Right. Clausewitz, he would say that was a mistake. He didn't like punishing the loser too much. Thought it would just lead to more problems down the road.
So for him, a lasting peace, it's not about crushing the enemy. It's about
finding a balance.
Yeah.
Recognizing that everyone has interests and being willing to, move on, even if it's tough.
It's about building a peace that will actually last. Okay, so we've talked about the end of war, but making a peace that will stick. Anything else from Clausewitz that we should cover?
Well, we've talked about war as a duel of wills. And we should talk more about the psychology of war. Clausewitz had a lot to say about that.
Yeah, he was interested in, the human side of things, not just armies and strategies.
Right. He said those psychological factors are really important. Just as important as having the best weapons. Maybe even more important.
So it's not just about who has the bigger army.
Nope. It's about things like morale, courage, discipline, being able to handle hardship, face fear, all that.
Like the Spartans at Thermopylae. They were totally outnumbered, But they fought so fiercely, their morale was incredible.
Exactly. A classic example. Clausewitz said an army with high morale, even if they're outmatched, they can still win. But a poorly led army, they'll fall apart, even if they have the best weapons.
So you have to understand how your troops are feeling and how the enemy is feeling.
Exactly. Clausewitz talked about all the things that can affect morale, the leader's personality, whether soldiers believe in what they're fighting for, winning and losing.
He even said that the fear of losing, that can make an army fight even harder.
Yeah, interesting, right. It comes back to that idea that war is really this clash of wills, a test of how determined each side is.
Okay, so Clausewitz understood that psychology was a big part of war. But did he have any advice about how to manage those psychological factors, like how to keep your troops' morale up or how to break the enemy's will?
Oh yeah, he did. And this is where, you guessed it, friction comes back in. Remember, friction is all those unpredictable things, the things that can mess up your plans.
Right. Fog of war, bad communication, all that.
Yep. And he said those things can really damage morale. If you're a commander and you don't account for friction, your soldiers can get demoralized. Plans fall apart. It can be a disaster.
So even if you have a brilliant strategy, if you don't pay attention to the human side of things, the psychology, it can all fall apart.
Exactly. And that's where a great commander comes in, someone who understands how friction works. They can anticipate it, adapt to it. They know how to keep morale up, even when things are really tough.
Like George Washington, he kept the Continental Army together through some incredibly hard times. He must have been a master at managing morale.
Yeah, he understood that side of things, the human side. That was a big part of his success, just as important as his military skills.
Okay, so we've covered friction, how it affects morale, how a good commander can handle it. What else about friction should we talk about?
Well, remember, Clausewitz said that friction is just part of war. It's always there. You can't get rid of it completely, but you can minimize it. By planning carefully, communicating well, building flexibility into your operations, basically create a culture where people can adapt.
So you're saying you have to accept that things will go wrong, but be prepared for it.
Exactly. And that's where training, discipline, experience, all of that comes in. Right. A well-trained army, led by commanders who've seen it all, they're going to be much better at dealing with the problems that always come up.
It's like that saying, the more you sweat in peace, the less you bleed in war. You have to be ready for the chaos, the friction.
Exactly. It means more than just physical training. It's about building mental resilience.
You're saying that soldiers shouldn't just be robots following orders. They need to be able to think for themselves.
Absolutely. You want soldiers who can make decisions on the fly, be creative, figure things out when the plan falls apart.
That makes sense. So friction affects morale. What else does it affect?
Well, think about how friction can mess with a commander's decision-making. Clausewitz said that friction makes it almost impossible to execute a plan perfectly in war. You're always dealing with imperfect information, unexpected delays, communication problems, fog of war.
So even if you have a great plan, actually carrying it out is really hard.
Yep. And this is where Clausewitz's ideas about decision-making under pressure come in. A good commander needs to decide quickly, even when they don't have all the information they need.
Be okay with not knowing everything. Trust your gut.
Right. That's where experience and good judgment come in, and that sense of warfare we talked about. A good commander can often sense the right course of action, even when things are unclear. And they're not afraid to act, even if it means changing the plan.
There's that great quote from Eisenhower, plans are worthless, but planning is everything.
Oh, that's a good one. It's the process of thinking things through beforehand that prepares you to make good decisions when you need to act fast.
Okay, so we've talked about friction.
How it affects morale and decision-making, how a good commander can try to manage it. What else about friction? Anything else our listeners should know?
Yeah, I'm still thinking about how, it can change the course of a whole war, create opportunities for one side or the other, like you were saying earlier.
Right, friction. It can slow down an attacker, disrupt their supply lines, exhaust the troops, even hurt morale. And that gives the defender time to regroup, get stronger, figure out how to exploit the attacker's weaknesses.
So it can really turn the tide, even if one side seemed to have the upper hand at first.
Exactly. And that's where Clausewitz's idea of the culminating point of victory is so important. Remember, even a successful attacker, they're going to hit a point where they just can't keep pushing forward. And a good defender, they can recognize that moment and use it to their advantage.
It makes me think of the Vietnam War. The U.S. military had all the firepower, all the technology, but they ended up stuck in this long, drawn-out conflict.
Yeah, great example. They couldn't adapt to the terrain. They had trouble winning over the local population. Friction wore them down.
So sometimes friction can be the deciding factor in a war, even if one side seems to have all the advantages on paper.
Exactly. And that's why Clausewitz put so much emphasis on studying military history. By looking at past campaigns, commanders can learn how friction has played out in different situations, how different leaders have dealt with it, what worked, what didn't.
So you learn from the mistakes of others, but you also learn those timeless principles, the things that are always true about war, no matter the technology involved.
Right. And that brings us to something else Clausewitz talked about, the different types of military objectives in war, the different things you're trying to achieve. He said it's crucial to understand these objectives and how they relate to the bigger political goals of the conflict. If you want a good strategy, you got to get this part right.
Okay, so it's not just about winning battles, it's about winning the right battles, right? The ones that actually help you achieve your political goals.
Exactly. Clausewitz starts with the most basic objective, destroying the enemy's army.
Okay, that seems pretty straightforward. You destroy their army, you win the war.
Well, in theory, yes. Sometimes that's how it works. But Clausewitz points out that destroying the enemy's army isn't always necessary, or even the best idea.
So there are other ways to win a war, other things you can try to accomplish, besides just wiping out the other army.
Yeah, and this is where he talks about the center of gravity. This term, it describes the enemy's most critical source of strength, the thing that holds their whole war effort together, the linchpin.
Okay, so instead of trying to destroy their entire army, you try to find that one key element, that center of gravity,
Yeah.
and you take that out.
You got it. And that center of gravity, it could be different things depending on the situation. Could be their capital city, their main army, of course, key allies, economic resources, could even be the will of their people to fight.
So it's about thinking strategically, looking beyond just the immediate battles, and trying to find the enemy's weak spot.
Exactly. A smart commander will focus on attacking the enemy's center of gravity instead of getting bogged down in battles that don't really matter in the long run.
It's kind of like a game of chess, where you're not just trying to capture any old piece, you want the king.
Perfect analogy. And just like in chess, the center of gravity can change as the war goes on. A good commander needs to keep reassessing, adapt their strategy as needed.
Okay, so lots to think about here. Different objectives, the idea of the center of gravity, strategic thinking. Anything else we need to cover before we wrap up our deep dive into Clausewitz?
Well, we should definitely talk about how wars end. It's not just about winning on the battlefield. It's about what happens after the fighting stops. It's about making peace.
Yeah, because if you make a bad peace, it can just lead to more fighting later on.
Exactly. And Clausewitz, he said the way a war ends depends on several things. The political goals of each side, how strong their armies were, how tired they are of fighting, all of it.
World War I is a good example of how not to end a war. The Treaty of Versailles was really harsh on Germany, and a lot of historians think that's part of why World War II happened.
Exactly. Clausewitz would have agreed with them. He didn't like punishing the loser too harshly. He thought it just caused more problems down the line.
So a lasting peace, it's not about crushing your enemy.
Nope. It's about finding a balance, recognizing that everyone has interests, and being willing to move forward together, even if it's difficult.
It's about building a peace that will last. Well, we've covered so much ground today. Clausewitz's ideas about the nature of war, the relationship between war and politics, the importance of strategy, the concept of friction. It's a lot to process. What do you think are the most important takeaways for our listeners?
Well, I think the biggest one is that Clausewitz challenges us to think about war in a much deeper, more nuanced way. It's not just about good guys versus bad guys or heroes and villains. It's about understanding the complex factors that drive conflict, the human element.
It's about seeing war as this dynamic struggle where things are always changing, where the fog of war, those psychological factors, they're always playing a role.
Right. And the second big takeaway is that even though Clausewitz was writing almost 200 years ago, his ideas are still relevant today. His principles of strategy, adaptability, understanding human behavior, learning from history, they're all still incredibly valuable.
Whether you're talking about military conflicts or even just everyday life, negotiations, disagreements, understanding those Clausewitzian principles can really help you.
Absolutely. And finally, I think Clausewitz's work is a call to action. He's saying, don't just sit back and accept the chaos and uncertainty of war. Study it, understand it, and find ways to manage its destructive potential.
So it's not enough to just read on war. It's about taking those insights and using them to make the world a better place.
Exactly. Well, I think we've reached the culminating point of our own deep dive into the mind of Karl von Clausewitz.
We hope you found it as fascinating as we did. We encourage you to keep exploring Clausewitz's work and see how his ideas can help you make sense of the world.
As Clausewitz himself said, the study of war is meant to educate the mind, not to teach recipes.
That's something to think about. Thanks for joining us for another deep dive. We'll see you next time.
Welcome back, everyone, to the deep dive. This time, we're going deep on a topic a lot of you have been asking about: military intervention in politics.
Ah, a classic.
Yeah. To help us dig into this, our listener sent over a fascinating book, The Man on Horseback.
Oh, yeah, that's a good one.
It really gets into, all the reasons why the military gets involved in politics, the different ways they do it, and, which countries are more susceptible to this kind of, interference.
Right. All crucial questions.
Yeah, so let's jump right in. I think most people, when they think of military intervention, they picture, the classic coup d'etat, like tanks in the streets, dramatic announcements on the radio, the whole 9 yards.
Yeah, the Hollywood version.
Exactly. But I have a feeling it's not always so dramatic in real life, is it?
Not at all. In fact, the Man on Horseback makes it clear there are several levels of intervention. Some are surprisingly subtle.
Oh, okay. Interesting. So what does that look like, this subtle intervention?
Well, think about it. A military advising a civilian government on security matters. That's pretty common.
Right. Makes sense. They are the experts in warfare and defense.
Exactly. But you can see how that advice could easily turn into pressure. Or even, threats and blackmail.
So it's a bit of a slippery slope.
You could say that. I mean, look at Japan in the 1930s. The army assassinated politicians who opposed their expansionist plans.
Wow. Yeah, that's definitely taking it to another level. So where do we go from there? What's the next level of intervention beyond just this kind of pressure?
Well, the book calls it displacement. The military removes a leader, or maybe a whole cabinet, and forces the installation of a new one.
Okay, so not overthrowing the whole system, just swapping out the players.
Exactly. A classic example is General Bakr Siddiqui's takeover in Baghdad in 1936. He basically forced a new cabinet, one that was, more sympathetic to the military.
I see. So influence, then displacement. What's the final, most extreme level?
That would be supplantment, the complete takeover, sweeping away the civilian government and establishing direct military rule, the classic coup.
Right. Although even then, it seems like they often try to maintain some kind of facade of civilian government, right?
Oh, absolutely. Egypt under Nasser is a great example. The officers originally just wanted to get rid of the government, but they ended up becoming the new ruling class themselves, behind a, shall we say, thin veil of civilian institutions.
Fascinating. So we've got these different levels of intervention, but the question is why? Why do they do it? I mean, the military is supposed to defend the country, not run it.
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? The book dives into that, and it argues that part of the answer lies in the military's nature. It's what they call a purposive instrument designed for fighting wars.
Purposive instrument.
I like
that. But how does that translate to getting involved in politics?
Well, think about the things that make a military effective. Centralized command, a strict hierarchy, discipline, seamless communication, that strong esprit de corps.
Yeah, it makes sense. Those are all good qualities in a fighting force.
Right. But those same qualities can also cause friction with civilian authorities. The military is used to giving orders, not taking them. And those strong internal bonds, they can lead to a sense of isolation, even distrust of the civilian world.
So it's almost like they think they know better, that they're the only ones who can really protect the nation.
It's a common theme, and it leads to one of the most frequent motives for intervention, defending what they see as their autonomy, pushing back against any civilian policies they see as interference.
I can see that. But I imagine there are other, maybe less noble motivations at play as well.
Oh, of course. There's always the self-interest angle, protecting their budget, expanding their influence, things like that.
The classic power struggle. But what about this idea of acting in the national interest? That always seems to be a big part of the justification.
It does, doesn't it? And on the surface, it sounds pretty noble. But you always have to ask, who gets to define what that national interest is?
All right, good point. National interest can be a very slippery concept.
Absolutely. And then you also have the factor of regionalism.
Regionalism, you mean divisions within the military itself?
Exactly. The military isn't always this unified force. You might have factions that favor certain regions or groups over others, and that can play a big role in these interventions.
Okay, so we've got a pretty good grasp on the why. Now, what about the where? Why are some countries more vulnerable to this kind of military interference than others?
That's where the idea of political culture comes in. Countries with what the book calls a low level of political culture, they tend to be much more susceptible.
Political culture.
Hmm.
Can you unpack that a bit? What exactly does that mean?
Think of it as a society's, well, its shared values and beliefs,
Yeah.
the attitudes towards politics. In a country with low political culture, people might not have much experience with democracy, or there might be deep disagreements about how power should be distributed.
So basically, places where democracy hasn't quite taken root.
Exactly. In those situations, people might be more likely to accept military intervention, especially if it's presented as a way to restore order.
Right, because it's seen as a strong hand, a source of stability.
That's the idea. And to illustrate this, think about some contrasting examples. Countries like the US or Britain, they have high political cultures, strong civilian institutions, a long history of civilian control over the military. Military intervention is incredibly rare there.
Right, there's this ingrained belief in democracy and a healthy suspicion of anyone in uniform trying to overstep.
Precisely. On the other hand, you have a lot of countries in Latin America, the Middle East, parts of post-colonial Africa that have struggled to establish those strong civilian institutions, and that makes them far more vulnerable.
It's almost like a vicious cycle, isn't it? Weak institutions lead to instability, which then justifies the military stepping in, which further weakens those institutions.
It's a dangerous pattern, that's for sure. And once the military has a taste of power, well, getting them to go back to the barracks can be a whole other challenge.
Speaking of which, is it even possible for them to fully withdraw from politics, to return to a purely professional role? Or is that just wishful thinking?
Well, that's a question we'll have to dig into in the next part of our deep dive.
Okay, now I'm hooked. I need to know what happens next.
Don't worry, we'll get there. It's a fascinating journey.
Okay, so we've established that getting the military out of politics can be a real challenge. But let's say they've already intervened. They're in charge. What happens then? How do these military regimes actually, govern? Is it all just marching orders and military tribunals?
Well, some certainly try to project that image, the iron fist approach, but a lot of them actually try to soften things a bit, incorporate civilian elements. The man on horseback calls this quasi-civilianized rule.
Quasi-civilianized. So like putting on a Democratic costume party but still running the show behind the scenes?
That's a pretty good way to put it. It's about balancing control with legitimacy. They want to look good, both domestically and to the international community.
Right, so how do they pull that off? What are some of the tactics they use?
Well, there's a whole spectrum. On one end, you have direct military rule, no pretense there. Take General Gürsel in Turkey, for example. He led the coup, headed a national unity committee made up entirely of officers.
Okay, straight from the barracks to the government, but that's not always how it goes, right?
Right. That kind of overt military control can be unsustainable. It can lead to a lot of pushback. So a lot of regimes take a more subtle approach. They might appoint a civilian cabinet, carefully chosen, of course, to handle the day-to-day governing.
So they're basically outsourcing the boring parts of running a country.
Something like that. And it get even more complex. They might set up institutions that look independent, like advisory councils or legislative bodies, but in reality, they're controlled by the military.
So it's all a bit of a facade. They're creating these institutions that look democratic, but the military is still calling the shots.
It can be, but sometimes it's a bit more nuanced than that. The military might genuinely believe that what they're doing is best for the country. They might see these institutions as a step towards stability, maybe even eventual civilian rule.
Okay, but if they're so confident in their intentions, why not just hold free and fair elections? Why bother with this whole charade?
That gets to the heart of it, the legitimacy problem. Military regimes, even the ones with, let's say, good intentions, they often struggle to get real popular support. And elections are risky. You might lose.
And we know the military doesn't like to lose.
Exactly. So instead of risking a genuine election, they might hold these carefully controlled elections or even just staged plebiscites to try to create the illusion of popular approval.
It's all about manufacturing consent.
In many cases, yes. but it's a risky strategy. People can usually see through it.
Right, and that's when those cracks in the facade start to show.
Exactly. It's this constant balancing act. The need for control versus the need to at least appear legitimate.
We talked earlier about Egypt under Nasser. Can you tell us a bit more about how that regime evolved?
Oh, it's a classic case. It really shows how a military intervention that starts out as a limited attempt to, displace a leader can gradually transform into something much more entrenched.
Kind of like mission creep, but on a political scale.
A very apt comparison. Remember, Nasser and the free officers, initially they just wanted to get rid of the monarchy. They weren't necessarily planning on taking over the whole country.
So how did that happen? How did they end up in charge?
Well, they went through several phases. First, you had the Revolutionary Command Council, all military officers, very similar to Gursal in Turkey. But they quickly realized that wouldn't work, so they started incorporating civilian elements.
Okay, so they were trying to soften their image a bit, make it look less like a straight-up military dictatorship.
Right. They appointed a civilian prime minister, held elections, although, of course, those were tightly controlled, eventually established a national union, kind of a single-party system.
So on paper, it was starting to look like a more, normal government.
Yes, but in reality, the military was still very much in control. That national union was largely a way to control the political landscape. And Nasser himself, even though he eventually dropped his military title, was the clear leader.
A president in all but name.
Exactly, and that's why the Egyptian case is so important. It shows just how hard it is to separate the military from politics once they've gotten that foothold. Even when they create these quasi-civilian structures, they often retain a lot of power behind the scenes.
It makes you wonder if these quasi-civilian regimes can ever really transition to actual democracies. Or if they're just inherently, flawed, designed to keep the military in charge, even if it's not obvious.
That's the big question, isn't it? Can a system that was created to consolidate military power ever truly become democratic?
That's what I'm really curious about. We've identified some serious challenges here, but I'm hoping there's a way forward, some way to break out of these cycles of intervention and instability.
Well, that's what we'll explore in the last part of our deep dive. We'll look at the things that make these successful transitions possible and the obstacles that stand in the way.
Okay, so we're back for the final part of our deep dive into military intervention. And if I remember correctly, we left off with a pretty big question. Can these quasi-civilian regimes ever really make that transition to, genuine democracies?
That's the fundamental challenge, isn't it? It's not just about getting certain individuals out of power. It's about creating a system where those interventions become, unthinkable, building a political culture that truly values civilian rule.
Right. But that sounds incredibly difficult. How do you even begin to make that kind of change, especially in countries that don't have much experience with democracy?
It's definitely a long-term process. But the man on horseback does offer some clues. And maybe surprisingly, it starts with the military itself.
With the military. Really, that seems a little, counterintuitive.
I know, it sounds strange. But for any transition to work, the military has to be on board. They have to accept their role as defenders, not rulers.
Okay, but how do you convince an institution that's used to having power to, just give it up?
It's not easy. It requires a real shift in mindset. The military leadership they have to recognize that their expertise lies in military affairs, not governing. And they have to buy into the idea that a functioning democracy is actually in everyone's best interest, including theirs.
So a bit of humility is needed.
You could say that. But it's not just about the military. Civilian leaders have to step up too. They need to assert their authority, make it clear that the military is subordinate to civilian control.
So it's about drawing the line in the sand.
Yes, and backing that up with action. Civilian leaders have to govern effectively. They need to prove that they can provide stability, security, all those things.
Right, so they have to show that they're actually capable of running the country.
Exactly. It's about building confidence in those civilian institutions, making the idea of the military stepping in less appealing.
Okay, so we've got a willing military and strong civilian leadership. What else is needed?
Strong institutions. Things like political parties, a legislature that actually functions, an independent judiciary, a free press. Those are the pillars of a healthy democracy.
Right, it's about having those checks and balances in place.
Exactly. You don't want any one institution, especially not the military, to be able to dominate. But even the best institutions are only as good as the people who run them.
You're talking about the people's role.
Exactly. You need citizens who understand and value democratic principles, who participate in the process, hold their leaders accountable. They can't just sit back and hope someone else will fix things.
It's that idea of civic duty, right?
Yeah.
Democracy isn't a spectator sport.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Yay.
But that kind of change doesn't happen overnight. It takes time, education, dialogue. You have to be willing to confront the legacy of military rule.
It sounds like a long and difficult process.
It is, but I think the goal is worth it. A society where civilian rule is the norm, where the military understands and accepts its proper role, where democracy can thrive.
I couldn't agree more. Well, thank you so much for walking us through all of this. It's a complicated topic and not always the most uplifting, but I think it's really important to understand.
My pleasure. These conversations are crucial, I think.
And to our listener, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you found it insightful. If you want to learn more, you know where to find us. Until next time, keep exploring, keep asking questions.
Welcome to an exploration of the military books by Huntington, Finer, Clausewitz, and Janowitz, essential texts in the field of civil-military relations. These authors have significantly influenced our understanding of the military's role in society and politics. Samuel P. Huntington's The Soldier and the State establishes foundational concepts of military professionalism and the necessity of civilian control over the armed forces. Samuel Edward Finer's The Man on Horseback analyzes the military's impact on political stability and power dynamics. Karl von Clausewitz's On War provides critical insights into military strategy, emphasizing the interconnectedness of the army, government, and civilian population. Lastly, Morris Janowitz's The Professional Soldier delves into the social and political aspects of military life, revealing its complexities and implications. Before delving into these pivotal discussions, please click the subscribe button to support the creation of more informative content. Now, let's begin.